I just have a quick note on Facebook sent to me, and it says tomorrow there is a career and job expo taking place at the Canyon Crest Dining and Event Center. That starts at 10 o'clock in the morning and will run until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I was just thinking that the only other reason I'd go there is to find out if the elk burger is back in season, which I've had there and is delightful. 9:34, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Also wanted to remind folks, if you missed it last week, we had an opportunity to speak with Dr. Christine Pickup, a doctor of audiology from Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert. And if you didn't catch our conversation on the air, it is on our YouTube page, our KLIX. It's News Radio 1310 KLIX on YouTube. And you can go back. A lot of videos posted of various guests who've been on our show over the course of the last couple of years. And so you can see Dr. Pickup. It's one of the most recent interviews there, talking about hearing health. She is the last, I guess, locally owned and operated, is how you'd put it, hearing specialist still in southern Idaho. And she wants to remind people that the most recent findings prove that when hearing loss is addressed with hearing aids, and these are not big and bulky any longer, the effects of your cognitive decline, if you're suffering from it, are greatly diminished. Hearing is critical for communication, for connection to others, and for overall well-being. And she reminds you, now is the time to improve your hearing. Call Mount Harrison Audiology for an appointment today, 312-0957. I saw something yesterday afternoon at Christian Post, and I'd never heard about this ever before, and I thought, I've got to mention it today. A writer by the name of Jerry Boyer is writing as a guest contributor. Apparently, he's a talk show host in southern Pennsylvania. And he mentions he was on the air 15 years ago this past Sunday, September 11th in 2001, when Flight 93 crashed, close enough to where he worked, where he could look out the window of the radio station and see the smoke billowing in the air. And then he went on to say this. A few weeks after the massacres, a listener faxed a copy of a story from the Tribune Democrat, a local paper which serves that community. And he says it tells the story of what first responders saw upon their arrival at the crash site. They were shocked to find that an unburnt Bible was among the smoldering and disintegrated wreckage. Actually, when they got there, about the only thing that was recognizable was a tire that was still smoldering and a Bible that happened to be open. The Bible laying open on the ground with its pages is white as snow, the writer says. The leather cover had been singed, but none of the pages ended up burned. Later, the Bible ended up at a hospital because a hospital chaplain was expecting to see some potentially injured coming in. He was a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Joe Mauricio, and he confirmed to the newspaper at the time, but again, a local paper, this was never picked up by national news media or by any international media. But he confirmed that the Bible was open, and he says it was open to the first book of Kings, chapters 13 through 15. Chapter 13 is the first chapter after the national split. Chapter 14 is the fascinating account of a man of God called to prophecy against the apostate king of Israel, but who did not obey God and instead accepted food from the apostate kingdom. This story sets the stage for everything which comes after, an unfaithful witness which fails to prevent the long arc of national decline, which begins in chapter 15. The writer says, here's what I think. But it's not just a miracle, which is to say a wonder from God meant to inspire us by telling us that he was there that day. It is what the New Testament called, and he said a sign, which is to say a message to his people. I believe it is a message about what kind of age we are in, why we are in that kind of age, and what will happen to our nation if we, like the man of God in chapter 14 of 1 Kings, are unfaithful to our calling. And you may remember, shortly after that day, 15 years ago, Jerry Falwell was on television on 700 Club with Pat Robertson. And the two of them were having a conversation, and they pointed out how, especially in Old Testament sense, when the people felt they no longer needed God, then God did not look out for the people. American liberals went absolutely nuts after hearing that, accusing these two men of saying that they were blaming the sinners in New York City for what happened, and that God was punishing us, which liberals obviously didn't understand what they were referencing, and that is, no, this is not about God throwing lightning bolts down to punish the sinners. This is about God simply saying, if you don't need me any longer, then I'm going to go tend to something else. And when that happens, it leaves you vulnerable to these types of attacks happening. The national humiliation that followed all of that. But I find it fascinating that the writer mentions this story about the open Bible there next to the smoldering ruins of the airplane, and yet no one in national media ever picked up on that story until now in Christian Post 15 years later. Why? Because it well would have vindicated what those two pastors were talking about on television in the days that followed that event. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. If I could, I want to wrap up the show on a high note today, talking a little bit about energy and energy resources. A real energy revolution going on in the United States. As bad as things may be culturally, if we would just keep going and follow our path to energy independence, could well prevent this country from finally sliding down the tubes to its inevitable end. Some days this time just flies so quickly by, and it's like life. You know, the older you get, it seems to time accelerates, and it's like going downhill. And the rock just keeps picking up steam as it rolls along. But on the other hand, we still get to observe the changing of the seasons, which is one way to mark the passage of time. We're only at 50 this morning, and we're not going to get a whole heck of a lot warmer today. 9:44, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com, which means if you have not yet tested that furnace, I've tested mine, by the way, it's working fine. But if you've not tested it, you should before it gets really cold. And if you've got a problem, which the test is what you do in advance to find out if you're going to need repairs, because the first night it's 20 degrees outside, the people who do the repairs are going to be very busy. So we've been recommending you've got to call the professionals at Ramsey Heating and Electric. The team at Ramsey's are going to come out and make sure that there are no troubles, that the job is done right if they need to do a fix, and they'll do it right the first time. Problem-free, cozy winters are found at Ramsey Heating and Electric, 2600 Overland Avenue in Burley, telephone number 678-0459. And Ramsey Heating and Electric reminds you they sell warm winters and cool summers. So, speaking of keeping your house warm, energy is becoming, I heard this the other day, Labor Day weekend normally marks the end of summer, and that means gasoline prices drop. Trilby Lundberg was saying, but no, after a week after Labor Day, the prices were on their way up. But then there was a big downturn, I think it was just yesterday, in energy prices all over the world again. And that is likely going to become more the norm for a long, long time to come. And it has been said that one of the reasons the United States didn't slip into a catastrophic depression following the economic meltdown back in 2008 is simply because we've had such cheap energy. None of which, by the way, you can thank the government for. Most of this has been through private enterprise and through what are called, I think erroneously, fossil fuels. Well, a couple of things to note here. Energy is about to get a lot cheaper on a grand scale. I've got a few stories telling us all about that. First of all, I saw this yesterday. I was doing my reading, last night before I went to bed. In Australia, they are pioneering a new plan to generate hydroelectric power by filling old mines with water. Abandoned mines, which they have a lot of. What they do is they pump water into these mines. And what they'll have is one mine that is a little higher than the other, which means you can then sink a pipe between the mines, and the water will rush quickly downhill from the higher mine to the lower mine, through turbines, spinning, of course, because of the water force, generating electricity. That's one new method, and it's going to be coming to this country too as well. Number two, I mentioned this briefly the other day, but there's a writer at Slate, and he is saying that big oil is back along with natural gas, and he's mentioning the big new find of 2 billion barrels of oil in Texas, and they expect that it may even be much bigger than 2 billion barrels. It could go into the tens of billions before they're done. And he writes, while the price of both natural gas and oil has fallen sharply, so too has the break-even point for extraction. So in other words, while the Saudis were trying to put our fracking business out of business, the people who were behind the fracking got better and more efficient at it, and they've dropped that cost down to the point where the Saudis will not be putting them out of business. And the writer says in the past decade, Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale has been one of the epicenters of the revolution. Again, the increase of raw production is a well told story, but the application of technology and infrastructure at scale, the construction of pipelines, and multi-billion-dollar terminals that enable export is creating new industries. In other words, more jobs. Cheaper energy, number one. More jobs, number two. Secondly, a lot of businesses that left the good old USA are now realizing if they come back and build a small plant or a big plant next door to one of these fields, they can sometimes have that natural gas just piped down the road a short distance, and it's very cheap, and they can run a profitable business that way. Even more jobs. The writer also says wind has always been a force on the Great Plains. Farmers harnessed it for years on a very small scale, but in recent years, wind has been discovered as a major supply of fuel for producing electricity. In the middle of the country, there are abundant wind resources. There's the availability of land, vast unused acreage that allows the establishment of wind farms. Companies have developed and harnessed the latest technology, larger and more powerful wind turbines. In effect, wind turbines, which seemed a little ridiculous a few years ago as a solid energy source, are becoming more efficient as the science grows. Michio Keiko, I believe is his name. He's the fellow you see on TV on all of these science programs. He has said that the future would be one of energy abundance, but he said it would come from many, many different sources. The traditional sources, oil and natural gas. But also a lot of these other sources would become more efficient. Good golly, nearly 10 years ago, I watched a television program. It might have been on what was called the Learning Channel at the time. I don't even know if it still exists, but I watched a program about what life would be like in America 50 years out. They were interviewing a scientist who was saying that the efficiency for electric power, that is solar power, was only between 14 and 18%. And he said, but we're never really going to have a solar revolution in this country until we probably get near 50%. That is, the energy that strikes those panels, if you could absorb a higher percentage, it would obviously make them a lot more efficient and a lot more profitable and help out our energy needs. Well, get this. We're up to about 38% now. This is coming from a website called cleantechnica.com. A Swiss startup called Insolite has figured out how to take pricey NASA-worthy solar cells and park them on your rooftop without busting your wallet. It's a course being charted by several other companies and researchers. It says the folks at Insolite, though, are confident that they'll beat the competition to the market. Their prototype is actually clocking in at just under 37% efficiency. That meets or beats similar solar products already on the market. The trick now is to see if Insolite can transfer its prototype to commercial production without losing efficiency and at a cost that will give an edge. So they're getting close to that 50% mark and actually well ahead of schedule because it was thought it might be 50 years. It's going to happen in about 10. And finally, I found this at something called EEnews.net. And it says that there was a fellow named Alexander McDonald. He's working in Colorado on a national network of 30,000 miles of high-voltage direct current electricity, which might cut electricity generating emissions by as much as 80% by rapidly moving surplus power generated by wind, solar, hydroelectric, and natural gas around the nation. The system, he thinks, could be built in 15 years. The resulting power, most of it coming from the weather, he asserts, would not lift energy bills much above traditional levels, and he says it would all be paid for in a few years simply in energy savings. He also goes on to write that the power lines would be underground. In other words, they would be impervious, that is, protected from an electromagnetic pulse, which is currently one of the fears we have, whether it come from a rogue nation like North Korea that would detonate nuclear bombs in our atmosphere above this country that could take out our power grid, or the sun could just simply have a massive flare and the sun could take out our power grid, could fry it. But not if it's buried underground. Then suddenly you don't have any worries about either a man-made attack or one coming from nature in that situation. So all of these things, good news ultimately, if we could just turn our culture around morally, and we could take advantage of these things on the energy front, there'd be no end to the United States lasting for 1,000 years. 9:52. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Telephone number to reach our show, 736-0300. Caller, you're up next.
Good morning, Bill. The mother of all invention is necessity. So as you really need it, you'll get it. But what gets me is we're shutting down and killing jobs while we're trying to find something. Well, we already have something to utilize, which is absolutely ridiculous. And then you have the conspiracy theorists and everything else that say that there are things out there already invented that would do all these things that get shut down and never told about. So, it's going to happen and it's coming. And we know from computers and cell phones and everything else, as technology grows, so does the efficiency of all these components that can create the electricity. I mean,
Sure.
when I go camping, I put 3 solar panels on my trailer, and I'm gone for a week, and I'm not on any hookups. So during the day, my batteries charge up, and I use them at night, and that's just as simple as that.
And thank you much for the call. And ingenuity definitely, it is the necessity. The phrase will come back to my mind in just a moment. 35 years ago, I remember watching a TV report about a man who invented a tire using polyurethane that would last far longer than any of our current tires, and it wouldn't need air. In other words, it was a spongy tire, but it wouldn't wear out. The tread wouldn't wear out for years and years and years to come. Now, 35 years later, he's probably dead, and his invention was ignored. But there's going to come a point where we can say we can no longer just store all of these old tires because of the huge dumps. So there you go. That ingenuity will come back. That invention is already there, and it will be adopted eventually. And that will be another one of those things that improves our environment, helps us with our own costs because you won't have to buy tires every couple of years. They'll last you 10, 20 years, perhaps. All of these things are just around the corner or have been around the corner and are ready and waiting for us. 9:55, you're up next. You're on the air.
And Nikola Tesla was drummed out of the country when he was being financed by Morgans, and he created, when you turn on your switches, the whole alternating current. He had basically all of the inventions, but he said, I can generate almost free energy. Obviously, that didn't. Our whole world it runs on the meters and pumps, so that didn't set very well to the big bankers and so forth. So he was discredited and drummed out of the country. But they have a national holiday for him in over in Europe from his native country. But that technology's been around for almost a century now, and I think there are people that are using that. But the other comment I'd want to make real quick is George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, are considered. He said that if this country ever quit worshiping Jesus Christ as the Lord of the land, that Providence would punish our country by natural calamities and withdrawing his spirit.
And I think that, and I thank you for the call. I was talking earlier about that Bible being found and never really covered by national media on 9/11 at the site in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I was also thinking about a story I mentioned to you yesterday where a fellow who is chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, his name is Castro, Martin Castro. With a last name like that, you figure he might be some sort of an atheist communist. It sort of runs in the family, right? Well, he had said that we needed to suppress people of religious faith. William McGurn, writing at the Wall Street Journal today, is following up on this, and he says Castro, his view is the prevailing view among American liberals. Barack Obama alluded to it when he derided small-town Americans bitterly clinging to guns or religion. Ditto for Hillary Clinton, who, in a remark about reproductive rights, declared that, quote, deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs, and structural biases have to be changed, unquote. They are trying to run religion out of the public sphere. Mr. Castro's contribution, though, he says, is so bad it's good, for he confirms that the progressive argument is mostly about insulting Americans with differing views. The translation of what he said is nuisances, including the First Amendment's free exercise of religion, guaranteed take a backseat to the rapidly multiplying non-discrimination causes such as the right to coerce any baker you want into baking the cake you want for your same-sex wedding. Why do we need a Donald Trump as president? Because he will appoint justices to the Supreme Court as well as the federal bench around the country who will start turning this pendulum back. And then you will no longer have to worry about sex perverts, 35-year-old men coming into the locker room at the swimming pool where your 3-year-old girl is changing out of her bathing suit. You will no longer have to be worried about your Christian faith being infringed upon because someone wants to make a martyr of you because you refuse to take a picture at a wedding or bake a cake. When we hear about government, by the way, cannot discriminate against you. But when it comes to regular human beings, we can make our own choices who we do business with. And we can do that according to the First Amendment to our religious beliefs. 9:58, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow between 8 and 10 o'clock. Don Hall will be joining us from City Hall. He'll be in studio with us just after 9 o'clock. Dr. Jonathan Tripp between 8:30 and 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Hope to see you then.